The refugee ship descended through Earth's atmosphere like a dying bird, trailing smoke and sparks across the twilight sky. Emergency broadcasts had warned of its arrival for hours, giving humanity plenty of time to prepare their response. By the time the vessel crash-landed in the fields outside the small town of Milbrook, that response had already crystallized into something cold and unwelcoming. Marcus Webb watched the ship settle into the wheat field from his farmhouse porch, a cup of coffee growing cold in his weathered hands. He was 53 years old, a widower who had spent the last decade working land that had belonged to his family for 3 generations. The news channels had been screaming about the alien vessel for days, stoking fears about disease, invasion, and the end of civilization as humanity knew it. The ship sat silent for nearly an hour before the hatch finally opened. Marcus saw figures emerge, but from this distance they were merely shadows against the setting sun. What he could see clearly were the military vehicles and news vans that had already formed a perimeter around the crash site. The flashing lights painted the evening in shades of red and blue. By morning, the situation had deteriorated. Marcus drove his truck into town for supplies and found Main Street transformed into something resembling a war zone. Protesters lined both sides of the road, their signs crude but their message clear. The aliens were not welcome. They should be sent back to wherever they came from. Earth for humans only. The local diner buzzed with conversation as Marcus sat at the counter. People spoke in hushed, angry tones about contamination protocols being insufficient, about resources being stretched too thin already, about how charity began at home. The mayor had apparently refused to allow the aliens into the town proper. They would remain in a containment area near the crash site until the federal government decided what to do with them. Marcus said nothing. He ate his eggs and toast, paid his bill, and drove back home. That afternoon, he found her collapsed at the edge of his property line. She was humanoid, which somehow made her alienness even more striking. Her skin held a faint luminescence, like moonlight on water, and her hair moved with a life of its own, flowing in patterns that had nothing to do with the wind. She wore what appeared to be the tattered remains of a uniform, and blood the color of copper stained her side. Her eyes, when they flickered open at his approach, were vast and golden, filled with pain and something that looked very much like resignation. Marcus knelt beside her, his knees protesting the sudden movement. Up close, he could see she was breathing in short, shallow gasps. The translator device clipped to her collar crackled to life as she noticed him. "Please," the mechanical voice said, though her lips moved differently. "I only wanted water. I will leave your territory." Marcus looked back toward the containment area in the distance, then down at this wounded being who had somehow walked miles across farmland in her condition. He thought about his late wife, Elena, who had volunteered at the hospital until cancer took her. He thought about what she would say if she could see him now. He slipped his arms beneath the alien woman and lifted. She weighed less than he expected, her bones perhaps hollow like a bird's. She made a sound that might have been protest, but she lacked the strength to resist. "My name's Marcus," he said, carrying her toward the house. "You're safe now." The next 3 days passed in a blur of quiet activity. Marcus set her up in the guest room, the one that had remained untouched since Elena's sister had visited years ago. He cleaned and bandaged the wound in her side, which seemed to be healing faster than any human injury would. He brought her water, soup, and eventually more substantial food, learning through trial and error what her biology could tolerate. Her name was Lyra, and she had been a botanist on her homeworld. The ship had carried 200 refugees fleeing a civil war that had consumed their planet. They had hoped to find sanctuary somewhere, anywhere. Earth had been their best hope. "I saw the faces of your people at the perimeter," she told him on the second evening, her voice stronger now, coming from her own mouth rather than the translator. She had learned English with startling speed. They looked at us like we were monsters, like we were nothing. Marcus sat in the chair beside her bed, his hands folded in his lap. People are afraid of what they don't understand. And right now, there's a lot of fear going around. But not you, she observed. Why? He was quiet for a long moment. My wife used to say that how we treat people at their lowest moment defines who we really are. I guess I'm just trying to live up to that. By the fourth day, Lyra could walk without assistance. Marcus showed her around the farm, watching as she marveled at the wheat fields, the vegetable garden, the old oak tree that had stood for over a century. She touched everything with a gentleness that spoke of genuine wonder, and she asked questions about crop rotation, soil composition, and weather patterns with the enthusiasm of a scholar. He cooked her the closest approximation to a feast his bachelor kitchen could manage. Roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, fresh bread, and vegetables from his garden. They ate at the dining room table, the one Elena had insisted on buying from an antique store 20 years ago. And Lyra told him stories about her homeworld's forests, where trees grew tall enough to touch the clouds and flowers bloomed in colors that had no names in human language. You treat me with such kindness, she said softly, like I am someone important. Marcus met her golden eyes across the table. You are someone important. You're a person who needed help, and that makes you important enough. The knock on the door came on the fifth morning. Marcus opened it to find 2 federal agents standing on his porch, their expressions professionally neutral. They knew he was harboring one of the refugees. Surveillance drones had tracked her movement from the containment area. They were here to retrieve her. She's injured, Marcus said, his hand tight on the doorframe. She needs more time to heal. The refugees are being relocated to a processing facility in Nevada, the taller agent said, not unkindly. She received medical care there. This is not negotiable, Mr. Webb. Lyra appeared behind him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. It's all right, Marcus, she said. You've given me more than I had any right to expect. I will never forget your kindness. They took her away in an unmarked van, and Marcus stood on his porch watching until the vehicle disappeared down the long dirt road. The house felt emptier than it had in years. 3 weeks later, he received a package. Inside was a small device that activated at his touch, projecting a holographic message. Lyra's face appeared, smiling in a way he hadn't seen during her time with him. Marcus, her recorded voice said, thanks to the publicity from those who sheltered us, public opinion has shifted. We have been granted temporary asylum. I am being sent to work at an agricultural research station, where I can use my knowledge to help both our peoples. They asked who I wished to thank publicly for their kindness. I gave them only one name. The message ended, but the device continued to glow softly. Marcus held it in his calloused hands and thought about fear and kindness, about walls and bridges, about how the smallest acts of decency could ripple outward in ways impossible to predict. The next morning, he returned to work in his fields, planting seeds for the next season's harvest. The wheat grew golden under the sun, swaying in patterns that reminded him of hair that moved like water, and he smiled.